Francis Fukuyama, Political Order and Political Decay, chapters 21 through 24, lecture 2. As in the last set of lectures, I plan for lecture 2 to be the final lecture on this material. With a lot of earlier material, I did 3 lectures on each chunk of readings, but partly in order to atone for my overly long lectures in the previous 2 weeks, and partly because I think it's just more efficient this way, I'm only going to do 2 lectures on this material. Now, just to give you a sense of the territory ahead, chapter 23 is about Japan. Chapters 24 and 25 are about China. So this is modern Japan and modern China. Now, I'm only going to go through chapter 24, but chapters 24 and 25 are about modern China. And then chapter 26 is a summary chapter where he compares the developmental paths of the 3 major post-colonial regions: Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and East Asia. Then after that, he moves on to the topic of democracy in the next big part of the book. And chapters 27 and 28 discuss the spread of democracy with an emphasis on the importance of social mobilization, of ideas, and of parties. And he looks at kind of the long European path of democratization. But so for this lecture, we start with chapter 23, which is called The Strong Asian State, which refers to Japan. Now, Japan, despite having a feudal character in its basic social system, nonetheless had a relatively strong centralized administration even prior to contact with the West. So it was feudal, but it was not decentralized in the way that, say, Western Europe was. But this sort of capable Japanese state, nonetheless, was not accompanied with rule of law or with any form of accountability. Now, Japan is an interesting case. Japan modernized rapidly during the Meiji Restoration, 1868 is when that gets going. And it's a case of what's called defensive modernization, where the fear of military inferiority to the West, right, this sort of idea, we don't want to be like China. We don't want to end up, basically prostrate and conquered like China. So that fear of military inferiority to the West and the fear of sharing the fate of China led elites within Japan to modernize the government, the economy, and society very rapidly. And in this process, a strong national identity could be taken for granted, right? So in terms of there was no problem with regard to the need for nation building. There's a pretty strong sense of national identity already there. So what happens is a relatively small number of elites, ministers, and bureaucrats had most of the power, and a lot of the modernizing leadership, the people who took the lead in modernizing society, were actually drawn from the old feudal leadership. So kind of the elite sort of class on top was made up largely of people that came from the old feudal families. So it wasn't that there was a shift in, so to speak, who was in charge, but they take the helm of a modernizing project, although at the same time, as Fukuyama mentions, the ministries themselves, the bureaucracies themselves, were professionalized during this time, in a way somewhat sort of similar to what happened in Germany. So the feudal elite actually initiate, along with certain ministers and bureaucrats, a modernization project, which involves, among other things, the professionalization of the ministries themselves. And Japan had also, during this time, it adopted a civil code through its constitution, even though it was sort of a quasi-absolutist state. Nonetheless, it adopted a civil code, kind of like what Prussia did. And so as in China and Germany, what this meant is that even though you technically speaking, governmental power was absolute, it nonetheless, arbitrary government was largely avoided because of the stability of the bureaucracy. So the actual machinery of administration was stable and rule-bound enough that even though there was, in effect, a kind of an absolute monarch over the top of it, that didn't lead to a lot of arbitrary governmental activity. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about this system, and he talks about this a bit on page 345, is that to the extent that there were limits placed on the emperor, it was not actually from bottom-up pressure. This wasn't something like the Glorious Revolution pushing for kind of constraints on monarchical power. But in fact, these limitations on the emperor, limitations on government, were self-imposed from the top. This was top-down modernization because it was believed that those limitations were necessary in order to modernize sufficiently, and by modernizing, acquire the power needed to resist Western oppression. So he talks about this on page 345, where he says, starting in the middle of the page, thus, the Japanese constitution, in contrast to the English one, was not the result of a prolonged conflict between two well-established social groups who agreed, in effect, to share power. Nor was the Meiji Constitution the product of grassroots mobilization on the part of middle and lower class social groups who sought to force a constitution on a reluctant monarch, as happened during the French Revolution. Virtually all observers agree that both the writing and the granting of the new constitution were heavily top-down processes, pushed by actors at the pinnacle of the power, like Ito Hirobumi. The oligarch's hand may have been forced by the popular rights movement, but he remained in control of the political process at all times. There was no equivalent of the Arab Spring in Japan. So it's kind of almost, top-down, almost authoritarian modernization. The force ultimately driving Japan to establish a constitution was not a domestic social group, but the example of foreigners. No Western power was, at this point, overtly trying to coerce Japan to grant a constitution. Rather, the Japanese themselves saw adoption of a constitution as a necessary condition for their recognition as a great power with rights equal to those of the West. They were following a syllogism that said, all modern states have constitutions. Japan aspires to be a modern state. Therefore, Japan must have a constitution. The immediate political pretext for making these changes was the desire to abolish the unequal treaties, something that was in fact accomplished by 1899. But this objective was driven less by economic interest than by the desire for the recognition of Japan's status as a modern society in the eyes of Western powers. End of quotation. Now that last claim is credible, but it is still hypothetical. That he does not, strictly speaking, prove that it was a desire for recognition of elites of Japan as a great power, rather than material interest that motivated the modernization. But nonetheless, it's a plausible conjecture. And obviously, he's trying to kind of tap into those different motivations. One of the things, as you know, that Fukuyama is trying to avoid is too much of an overtly materialist account of development. Okay, now, as you probably know, the military grew very nationalistic and very autonomous within the government, and ultimately guided Japan into imperial expansion and war, which ultimately ends disastrously for Japan. And after the war, you get democracy, though a kind of strange one. And I can't really go into the details, but you have this kind of fascinating combination in Japan, where on the one hand you have very powerful bureaucracies that are, kind of shielded to a certain degree from politics, although the chief ministers do rotate out of government and into the private sector. So they'll serve as a high-level minister for a while, and then they'll retire and become, go out of the board of a big corporation and make lots and lots of money. And this process of moving from a high level of the bureaucracy to a high level of the private sector and making bank, in Japan, the term for that is coming down from heaven. So when a high-level bureaucrat is retiring in order to take a lucrative post in the private sector, that's called coming down from heaven. I think that's a fantastic image. There's a similar phenomenon in France, by the way. France has some very powerful high-level civil service ministers, and when they retire, sometimes they also will go into the private sector and make tons of money. But whereas in Japan, that process is called coming down from heaven, in France, the process would translate to putting on the slippers. So like the idea of like retiring from government in order to get rich in the private sector is called putting on the slippers, pantouflage. So in a couple of those countries where you have really powerful government ministers, they actually have a whole term for this process of retiring and then getting filthy rich. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Obviously, in America, we call it the revolving door because people will retire, go into the private sector, but then they'll go back into government. So they'll go around and around, whereas the process is more of a government, and then over into industry in places like Japan and France. But at any rate, so you have this interesting combination where you have these very professional and very powerful bureaucracies combined, however, with extremely clientelistic political parties, right? Which is not a combination you would expect, because normally a clientelistic democracy inhibits the growth of powerful bureaucracies. But you have it in Japan, and you can read the latter pages of the chapter for more details about that, but I'm not going to hold you accountable for knowing those things. And so now we transfer to China, the first chapter on modern China, chapter 24, which is entitled The Struggle for Law in China. Very basic overview that I'm going to give you. China had a state, though there were cycles of development and decay over the history of kind of classical China. But of course, you never had genuine rule of law. So you have the state, but you don't have rule of law. There were efforts at constitution making in the early 20th century, reform movements. But those efforts at constitution making were themselves engulfed in conflict following the 1911 revolution, which initiated the Chinese Republic and a period of sort of warlordism, of fragmentation and competition for power among warlords. Now, after the world wars and the chaos of warlordism and all that, you finally end up with the communist takeover in 1949. But when the communists take over, Mao and his supporters also had, spoiler alert, very little concern for rule of law. Because remember, for Fukuyama, rule of law consists in some kind of set of rules that by social consensus must bind not only the ordinary people, but also the rulers. And there was nothing like that with the Chinese Communist Party, obviously. And in fact, after the communist takeover, you get further waves of kind of chaos and mismanagement with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and all that. So China is left in really bad shape by the mid-70s. And in 1978, Deng Xiaoping begins the political and market reforms that give us contemporary China, the China that you guys know and hear about in the news. Where you have these kind of special export zones where different rules apply. You have the encouragement of foreign direct investment, the building up of industrial production, the reliance upon exports to other countries, so basically where China becomes the workshop to the world. But even with the reforms, the legal and institutional reforms that made it possible for this kind of economic modernization, it's still the case that you don't really have rule of law. Right? And the Communist Party is still firmly on top. There's no accountability at the national level. So you have kind of quasi-private property. It's not full-blown, legally protected private property of the sort that you have in the West. But as Fukuyama puts it, it's good enough. Often it's good enough to inspire enough confidence for there to be foreign investment. So you have kind of quasi-private property, quasi-contract enforcement. But again, ultimately the party is in charge and not subject to any effective formal or institutional constraints. So again, you have something, it's almost approaching something like that idea of having a kind of civil code that makes things fairly stable, although with a higher level of corruption than what you found in Japan or Prussia. But at the top of it is still an absolute power, although in this case it is the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a degree to which the power of in China is becoming even more concentrated than it had been after 1978. But still, you have more rules that govern society. Property rights are relatively secure. Promotion and succession of leaders is more rule-bound than it used to be, although, again, that's being somewhat undone by Xi Jinping. But at any rate, you have this kind of modern China that still does not have rule of law, even as it's built up its state capacity. But it has good enough rule by law that it's been able to modernize economically and attract foreign investment. So that's all I have to say about chapter 24. Again, these chapters, they have a lot of detail, especially if you want to learn more about the recent history of these countries. This book is a good place to start. But that's the kind of stuff that an ordinary reader could read this and get that. So I'm sticking to the main points, the main conceptual points, and you can fill in the details for yourself. So that's all I have to say about chapters 23 and 24. In the next set of lectures, I'll move on to chapters 25 through 28.